Weddings are supposed to be the crown jewel of family life. They are supposed to be about love, unity, about honoring the people who raised you and carried you. A father walking into his daughter's wedding should feel like stepping into a reward for a lifetime of sacrifice. It should be the day when the long nights, the overtime hours, the scraped-together savings, all of it is recognized in the proud glance of a daughter who knows what her father gave for her happiness. But sometimes, reality shatters the picture we carry in our hearts. If you've ever felt pushed aside, humiliated, or treated like you didn't matter by the very people you love most, subscribe to this channel. These are the stories families would rather keep hidden. But here we tell them, so that dignity and truth can live on. He had imagined this day for years. He remembered her as a little girl, running barefoot in the yard, a plastic crown on her head, declaring herself a princess. He remembered the way she clung to his neck when thunderstorms rattled the windows, whispering, "Don't let go, Daddy." He remembered standing at the edge of soccer fields, shouting her name until his voice cracked, no matter how tired he was from a 12-hour shift. And he remembered the countless sacrifices. The vacation skipped so she could go to summer camp. The new shoes he never bought so she could have the best dress at her school dance. The nights he ate leftovers cold from the fridge so she could have enough for her friends. Every father hopes those things add up to love that is seen, to respect that is remembered, to a place of honor at life's milestones. So when he pulled on his best suit that morning, a jacket not new but pressed with care, a tie Eleanor once bought him years ago, he thought it would be enough. His pride wasn't in the fabric, but in the role. He wasn't there as just another guest. He was the father of the bride. The venue was beautiful. String lights draped across wooden beams, music floating gently through the air, the scent of flowers heavy with celebration. Guests moved about in elegant clothes, voices mingling in laughter. He carried himself with quiet dignity, though his heart pounded with excitement. This was his daughter's day, but it was also his. He walked in, scanning the room, soaking in the atmosphere. For a moment, he felt joy bubbling up, the kind of joy only a parent feels when they see the child they raise step into a new life. But then came the chart, the seating chart, a map of belonging, a silent declaration of who mattered and where they stood. His eyes moved down the neat rows of names, searching eagerly for his. He imagined it near the front, perhaps even beside his daughter, or close to the head table where family was meant to be. Then his eyes found it, not in the front, not near the groom, not even close to the family section, but in the very back, near the exit, a table reserved for people barely part of the day. Confused, his chest tightened. He thought surely it was a mistake, a printing error, a misplaced card. He found his daughter, radiant in her dress, and leaned close. "Sweetheart," he whispered gently, "there must be a mistake. My seat is listed in the back." But her expression didn't waver. Her eyes met his with a chill he had never seen before. "This seat is for my father-in-law," she said firmly, pointing toward the honored table. "You stay in the back." The words landed like a hammer. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a joke, not nerves, not a slip of the tongue. This was deliberate, conscious, final, in that instant. Every memory he had carried with pride felt like it was set on fire. The scraped-together dollars, the late nights, the moment of sacrifice, erased with a single sentence. And worse, it was spoken not by a stranger, not by a critic, but by his own daughter. The girl he once cradled against his chest had now chosen another man to take his place in the spotlight on the most important day of her life. Around him, people shifted. Some guests lowered their eyes, pretending not to hear. Others exchanged glances, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. A few even smiled awkwardly, choosing the comfort of silence over the courage of truth. But not one voice spoke for him. And so he stood alone, with the echo of her words louder than the music, louder than the chatter, louder than the very vows being promised up front. He forced a smile that cracked at the edges. He nodded slowly, though his heart screamed. And then he walked, step by step, past the tables where people laughed and toasted, past the glow of celebration, past the place where his honor should have lived, all the way to the back, near the exit. There he sat. From that seat, he could see the man who had taken his place. The groom's father, laughing with the couple, clinking glasses, receiving toasts. Every smile directed toward that table was another nail in the coffin of his pride. Every camera flash that caught them together was a photo where he didn't belong. He wasn't the father of the bride anymore. He was an afterthought, a shadow in the back row. But what no one in that room knew, what his daughter, his new in-laws, the guests, and the world failed to see, was that he carried something far greater than a seat at a table. Because a father's worth isn't determined by where he sits at a wedding. Dignity isn't assigned by a name card. Respect doesn't vanish when others fail to give it. And though they thought they had silenced him, though they believed they had written him out of the story, they didn't realize this was only the beginning. Because sometimes humiliation doesn't break a man. Sometimes it awakens him. And as he sat there in the very back row, listening to music and laughter muffled by the echo of his daughter's rejection, he began to write a new chapter in his heart. A chapter where he would no longer beg for respect. A chapter where he would prove, in ways louder than applause, that a father's value cannot be stolen by a wedding chart. When you look at a wedding, what you see is the end result. The polished dress, the shining shoes, the flowers carefully arranged, the music echoing off the walls. What you don't see are the years it took to get there. The childhood scraped together by sacrifice. The nights of worry and the mornings of hope. The invisible scaffolding of a parent's love that holds the moment up. For him, every step his daughter took toward adulthood was a step he had carried on his back. From a first cry in the hospital, he had promised Eleanor, "I'll give her everything I can, even if it breaks me." And for years, that promise shaped every choice he made. He remembered the little things, the ones that stick to a father's heart. The way she used to wobble across the living room floor, her tiny feet padding toward him as though he were the only safe place in the world. The way she tugged his sleeve when she wanted him to push her higher on the swing, shouting, "Don't let go, Daddy!" with a laugh that melted exhaustion. He remembered holding her through storms, whispering, "It's just thunder, sweetheart, I've got you," while the house rattled with rain. Her little hands clutched his shirt so tightly he thought the fabric might tear. But he never pulled away. He never let go. Money was always thin, but love was thick. He worked double shifts, sometimes triple, to keep food on the table and shoes on her feet. He wore the same boots until the soles nearly gave out, while she walked into school with the newest pair, because he refused to let her feel less than anyone else. Eleanor would shake her head, saying, "Henry, you need new clothes." But he would smile and answer, "She needs to feel proud when she walks in with her friends. That matters more than how I look." Sacrifice became second nature, invisible, a rhythm to his days. When she wanted piano lessons, he pawned his old tools to pay for the first month. When she dreamed of going to camp, he skipped lunch for weeks, saving every dollar in a tin can until the tuition was covered. When prom came, and she wanted a dress that sparkled like the ones in magazines, he took an extra overnight shift at the factory and handed Eleanor the envelope with a quiet smile. "Make sure she feels like a princess," he said. And when she twirled in that dress, beaming at herself in the mirror, he stood in the doorway, tired of bone but full in the heart. He believed, with all of himself, that these things would be remembered, that one day, when the spotlight shone on her life, she would look back and see the hands that held her steady, the shoulders that carried her weight. He dreamed of the wedding day not as his glory, but as his reward, a moment to see her eyes shine with gratitude, to feel her arm hooked through his as they walked together, to know that every sacrifice had built this milestone. But in the years leading up to it, he began to notice small cracks, moments when she seemed embarrassed by his simplicity, times when she introduced him with a nervous laugh, as though his worn clothes or tired hands diminished her shine. Once, after he picked her up from school, she whispered, "Dad, maybe don't park so close. People will see the truck." He had laughed off, hiding the sting, telling himself it was just a phase, just the awkwardness of youth. But those words lingered, tucked away in the corners of his memory. He never stopped loving her. Not once. When Eleanor passed, the bond between father and daughter became even more precious. He told himself he had to be both mother and father now. He doubled his efforts, tried harder than ever to fill the empty spaces. He cooked her favorite meals, even if they didn't taste quite like Eleanor's. He sat through school plays, clapping until his hands ached, even when she rolled her eyes at his enthusiasm. He drove her to every practice, every rehearsal, every party, waiting in the car until she was ready to go home. He gave her everything he could, and he believed, that love like that could not be erased. On the morning of her wedding, he stood in the mirror, adjusting his tie with shaky fingers. The suit was old but neat, the jacket a little loose at the shoulders, but clean. He imagined Eleanor's voice, teasing, "You'll look just fine, Henry." He smiled at the thought, his heart full of anticipation. Today, he told himself, she'll see me. Today, she'll know. Every coin saved, every hour worked, every dream postponed. Today it all comes together. Today, I'll be proud not because of where I sit, but because she'll honor the man who never let go. That was the hope he carried with him as he walked into the hall. The hope of a father who had given it all, who had built his daughter's world piece by piece, who only wanted to stand in his rightful place, not for applause, but for acknowledgement. And that is why the words cut so deeply. Because humiliation at a wedding doesn't start at the seating chart. It starts in the heart of a father who remembers every sacrifice, every late night, every quiet act of love, and suddenly realizes that none of it seems to matter. It starts when a daughter looks into the eyes of the man who gave her life and says, without flinching, "This seat is for my father-in-law. You stay in the back." The wedding hall glowed with celebration. Candles flickered in glass holders, casting warm light across tables draped in white linen. The music played softly in the background, a blend of strings and piano that gave the entire place an air of magic. Guests laughed as they moved through the room, glasses of champagne sparkling under chandeliers. To anyone else, it was perfect. To him, it should have been perfect. After all, this was his daughter's day, a day he had carried on his back through years of sacrifice. As he stepped into the hall, his chest swelled with both pride and nerves. He wasn't here for himself. He was here for her, the little girl who once clutched his hand crossing the street, now a bride ready to step into her new life. He straightened his jacket and smiled faintly, soaking in the moment. For a few precious seconds, joy pushed away the fatigue of years, and he believed this was where everything would finally come full circle. Then came the chart. The seating chart stood at the entrance, decorated with flowers and elegant calligraphy. Guests crowded around it, laughing as they found their names and teased each other about where they'd been placed. He waited his turn, heart thumping with anticipation. Surely, he thought, his name would be close to hers. Surely, he would sit where everyone would see he was her father. His eyes scanned the list once, then again, confusion growing. Table 1, Table 2, Table 3. His name wasn't there. He traced down the rows, his finger trembling slightly, until finally, there it was, Table 17, the very back, near the exit, almost touching the kitchen doors. He blinked, certain it had to be a mistake. His throat went dry as he leaned closer, reading again, desperate for another explanation. But the truth was plain, written in black ink. His place had been pushed to the edge, far from the head table, far from his daughter. The weight in his chest grew heavy. He turned, eyes searching for her. She stood nearby, radiant in her gown, laughter surrounding her like sunlight. For a moment, he almost didn't want to disturb her, almost didn't want to bring his fear into her joy. But the need for clarity pushed him forward. He stepped to her side, his voice gentle but strained. "Sweetheart, there must be a mistake. My name, it's in the back. Table 17. Surely they printed it wrong." Her smile faded. She glanced at him, then at the seating chart, then back at him again, and with chilling calm, she said words he would never forget. "This seat is for my father-in-law. You stay in the back." The words hit like a physical blow. He staggered internally, though his body held still. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard, but her eyes were steady, her tone unshaken. She meant it. The daughter he had raised, protected, provided for, had chosen another man to sit in the place of honor. Around them, conversations faltered. Guests within earshot shifted uncomfortably. Some pretended not to notice, their eyes darting away. Others exchanged glances, pity flickering across their faces but never forming into words. A few even chuckled nervously, as if to dismiss the tension. But not a single voice defended him. The silence of the room became an accomplice to her words. He forced a faint smile, his lips trembling as he nodded. His eyes stung, but he refused to let the tears fall where others could see. Pride, or maybe stubbornness, held him upright. "Of course," he whispered, "if that's what you want." And with that, he turned and began the long walk to the back. Every step was agony. He passed tables filled with laughter, glasses clinking, people leaning close to share inside jokes. He passed a head table, where the groom's father, the man who had been given his rightful place, sat smiling, his hand on the groom's shoulder, his voice filling the air with confidence. He kept walking, past the glow of celebration, past the warmth of recognition, until at last he reached the edge of the room. Table 17, his place. The kitchen door swung open and shut nearby, waiters rushing past with trays of food, plates clattering, the smell of spices and steam filling the air. The noise drowned out the speeches, muffled the music. He sat down, his chair wobbling slightly against the wall. From here, the bride and groom were little more than distant figures, their joy blurred by distance and shadow. He tried to focus on the celebration, to convince himself it didn't matter. But the truth pressed down on him. He wasn't the father of the bride that night. He was a shadow in the back row, an afterthought, tucked away where no one had to see. Humiliation in public is a wound sharper than any private betrayal. It doesn't just pierce the heart, it brands it in front of others. He could feel eyes glancing his way, some with pity, others with discomfort, but none with courage to say, "This isn't right." And so he sat invisible while another man claimed his place in the story. But deep inside, as the noise of laughter and music washed over him, something stirred. Humiliation can break a man, or it can awaken him. And as he sat in the back, Eleanor's voice seemed to echo in his heart. Dignity isn't given, it's claimed. The seat might have been at the back, but his story wasn't finished. The morning after the wedding, the house was still. Sunlight streamed to the curtains, dust floating in golden beams. But the air felt heavier than it should have. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, staring at the silent telephone on the counter. Surely, he told himself, today she would call. Maybe the excitement of the wedding had clouded her judgment. Maybe she hadn't realized how cruel the word sounded, how humiliating it had been to send her own father to the back. In the quiet of the morning, he imagined the phone ringing, her voice breaking with apology. But the phone never rang. By noon, he gave in and dialed her number himself. The line clicked, then her voice came, bright but hurried. "Hi, Dad." He froze for a second, heart pounding. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said softly. "Oh, the wedding was perfect," she answered quickly. "Everything went so well. Everyone had such a great time." Her words struck him harder than silence. Perfect? Great? Did she not see him at the back? Did she not remember the words she had spoken, the look in his eyes? He waited, hoping she would say more, hoping for a pause, a sigh, a crack in her voice, something that would open the door to honesty. But nothing came. After a few minutes of casual chatter, she said, "I've got to go," and the line went dead. He set the phone down slowly, the silence filling the room again heavier now. Days turned into a week. No apology came. No guest who had witnessed the moment reached out. People he had known for years, the neighbors, the family friends, spoke of the wedding as if it were a fairy tale. They said it was beautiful. One neighbor told him. The decorations, the music, the speeches, it must have been magical. He smiled politely, forcing the corners of his mouth upward, but inside, he felt the words twist. Magical for them. For him, it had been exile. At church, friends patted his shoulder. "You must be so proud. Your daughter looked radiant." "Yes," he replied quietly. "She did." But the pride they assumed was as had been replaced by something else. Something hollow. Pride cannot live where dignity has been erased. Nights were the worst. He would sit in his recliner, Eleanor's photograph resting on the shelf beside him. her eyes forever frozen in gentle kindness. He imagined what she would have said if she'd been alive to see it. "Henry, don't let it break you. You are more than their blindness." But the silence around him screamed louder than any comfort. He pulled out an old photo album one night, flipping through pages filled with her childhood. There she was in pigtails, holding a balloon at the county fair. There she was at her high school graduation, beaming as he clapped from the front row. There she was at prom, twirling in a dress he had worked 2 extra shifts to pay for. He traced her face with his finger, tears welling. How could the girl in those pictures grow into a woman who looked him in the eyes and said, "You stay in the back"? The silence was not just absence. It was a verdict. Her lack of apology, the way the guests ignored it, the way life moved on. It told him exactly what he didn't want to admit. In their eyes, his humiliation wasn't a mistake. It was acceptable, and that truth cut deeper than her words. He began avoiding people. At the diner, when old friends asked about the wedding, he gave short answers, changing the subject quickly. At the store, he ducked down aisles to avoid conversations. Pride, or perhaps shame, kept him from confessing the truth. He didn't want pity. He wanted respect. But respect never came. One evening, as he sat in the fading light, the phone glowed on the table beside him. He stared at it, willing it to ring. But it stayed dark. Finally, he whispered aloud, to no one but Eleanor's photo, "I waited for their apology. It isn't coming." And in that silence, something shifted, because sometimes the absence of words speaks louder than the words themselves. The days after the wedding bled into each other, each one carrying the same heavy silence. The phone didn't ring. The doorbell stayed quiet. Life outside moved forward, but inside, time felt stuck. The humiliation from that night replayed in his mind with cruel precision. The chart, the words, the long walk to the back table. At first, he told himself it was a moment of poor judgment. Stress, nerves, the whirlwind of a wedding. Surely she hadn't meant it. Surely she would reach out once the haze cleared. But as the weeks turned into months, the silence became its own answer. And he began to realize something he didn't want to admit. This wasn't an accident. This was who she had become. It wasn't the first time. After all, memories began to surface, moments he had buried under layers of forgiveness. The time she was a teenager, asking him to drop her off 2 blocks from school so her friends wouldn't see his old truck. The time she introduced him at a college event, her voice tinged with embarrassment, as if his simple clothes diminished her shine. The holidays when she brushed past his gifts, thanking others first while his sat unopened on the floor. Each memory returned, sharper now, each one a thread in the tapestry of disregard. He had excused them all back then. "She's young," he told himself. "She'll understand one day." But the wedding proved that day would never come. One evening, he sat at the desk in his study, pulling open drawers he hadn't touched in years. Inside were envelopes, faded pay stubs, old receipts, evidence of a lifetime of work. He ran his fingers over the yellowing paper, remembering the double shifts, the cold nights, the meals skipped, all for her. And yet, when the spotlight came, he had been pushed into the shadows. His throat tightened, anger swelling in his chest. "I gave everything," he whispered into the quiet room. "And this is what I became. A joke, a seat by the kitchen." The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, he didn't just feel sadness. He felt rage. Not the blind rage of fists or shouts, but the cold, clear rage of a man who realizes he's been erased by the very person who should have honored him most. That night, he sat in his recliner, Eleanor's picture glowing faintly in the lamplight. He imagined her voice, steady and calm. "Henry, love without respect isn't love. Don't let them shrink you." His hands trembled. He had lived his entire life believing that sacrifice alone was enough, that if you gave and gave, eventually the people you loved would see it. But now he knew better. Sacrifice without recognition becomes invisible, and invisible love leaves scars. He thought of the wedding again, the groom's father at the head table, clinking glasses, smiling for photographs. The man hadn't worked the overtime, hadn't skipped meals, hadn't patched dresses or driven through storms. And yet, he sat in the place of honor, while the true father sat by the door. It wasn't just unfair. It was theft. They had stolen his role, stolen his dignity, stolen the honor that was his by right. Something inside him snapped. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered, "This ends here." Not the pain, he knew that would stay. Not the memories, those would never fade. But the pattern, the endless giving without respect, the endless waiting for recognition that would never come. That ended now. The breaking point wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout or a slammed door. It was quiet, steady, final. He realized he would no longer beg for a seat at a table that had already erased him. He would no longer measure his worth by a daughter's blindness. He would claim his dignity, not because they gave it, but because it was his all along. The weeks after the wedding stretched into a season of silence. Morning sunlight still filtered through the same curtains. Neighbors still waved as they mowed their lawns. The world kept spinning. But for him, everything felt different. He no longer looked at the phone, expecting it to ring. At first he had, sitting in his recliner, glancing every few minutes at the silent screen. Each day, he told himself, today she will call. Today she will realize. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of silence told him more than words ever could. She wasn't going to call. The humiliation had been public. Everyone had seen it, heard it, and yet no one had spoken up. No apology came from her. No word from guests who had watched. The world had deemed it acceptable to erase him, and that verdict cut deeper than the insult itself. He began to withdraw. At the diner, when friends asked how the wedding had gone, he gave short answers, deflecting with a weak smile. At church, when people praised how beautiful the ceremony had been, he nodded politely, his lips pressed tight to keep the bitterness from spilling out. He avoided gatherings altogether. The thought of people congratulating him for a day that had carved a wound in his chest was too much to bear. At night, the house felt emptier than ever. Eleanor's photograph sat on the shelf, her kind eyes frozen in time. He often spoke to her aloud, whispering the thoughts he couldn't share with anyone else. "Did we do it wrong, Eleanor?" he asked one night, voice breaking. "Did we give too much? Did we raise or forget?" The silence of the house gave no answer, only the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of old wood. Loneliness crept into everything. Meals were bland, conversations rare. Even walking through town felt heavier, as if everyone could see the humiliation lingering on him. He carried it like a second skin, invisible but suffocating. One evening, he sat on the porch, watching the glow of lights in the houses across the street. Inside, families gathered for dinner, their laughter carrying faintly through the air. He saw fathers at the head of tables, passing dishes, telling stories, their children leaning in with respect. And he wondered why his story had turned out so differently. He whispered to himself, "I gave her everything. Why wasn't it enough?" But slowly, a shift began. It started small, almost imperceptible. One morning, instead of staring at the phone, he opened an old journal. He wrote a single sentence. "They erased me at her wedding, but I will not erase myself." The next day, he wrote another. "Respect doesn't vanish just because others refuse to give it." Each day, he added a few more lines. His words weren't polished, but they were raw, honest, unfiltered. And in those pages, he began to reclaim the voice that had been silenced. He also began to sort through the old boxes in his study. Papers from decades past, pay stubs, receipts, photographs. Each item reminded him of sacrifice, a choice, a moment of love. He realized those pieces told a story his daughter had chosen to ignore, but that didn't make it any less true. He laid the papers out on the desk one evening, looking at the life he had built, and he whispered, "This is my testimony. Even if no one else sees it, I know what I gave." Days grew into weeks, and he noticed something else. The anger began to change shape. It was no longer a raw wound, but a quiet determination. He stopped waiting for apologies. He stopped checking for messages. He stopped measuring his worth by the silence of others. Instead, he began to measure it by the small acts of dignity he gave himself. Cooking a proper meal, even if it was just for one. Fixing the squeaky hinge on the back door. Cleaning Eleanor's old jewelry box and placing it neatly on the dresser. These weren't grand gestures, but they reminded him, I am still here. I still matter. One evening, he sat on the porch again, the sky painted with streaks of orange and purple. He watched the families across the street, but this time, instead of feeling envy, he felt something else. Resolve. He whispered, they may have put me in the back, but I decide where I stand now. The aftermath of humiliation hadn't erased him. It had carved him into someone stronger, someone who no longer begged for recognition, someone who understood that dignity isn't handed out, it's claimed. And though the wound remained, he carried it differently now, not as a mark of shame, but as a reminder. Because even when others push you aside, you can choose not to push yourself aside with them. For months after the wedding, he carried the weight of humiliation in silence. But silence can do strange things. It can bury a man, or it can sharpen him. And slowly, as the weeks passed, he realized he wasn't as powerless as they believed. His daughter thought she had defined him by where she placed him that night. To her, he was a man to be hidden in the shadows, tucked near the kitchen, erased from the story she wanted to tell. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he carried something far more powerful than a seat at a table. The secret had been building for years, almost invisibly. Eleanor had known. She was the one who first insisted they save, no matter how little they had. A little today becomes a lot tomorrow, she used to whisper as she folded bills into a tin box in the pantry. Over time, the tin box became a savings account. The savings account became investments. Quiet, steady, careful. He never flaunted it, never boasted. His clothes stayed plain, his truck stayed old, his dinner stayed simple. People mistook it for poverty. They mistook humility for weakness. But behind the modest exterior, he had built something lasting, a legacy. One afternoon, months after the wedding, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find his daughter standing there, her husband at her side. Her eyes looked tired, her smile forced. Dad, she began, we could use some help. She spoke of bills, of debts piling up, of the new house they wanted but couldn't quite afford. The words came out rehearsed, like a plea carefully packaged to sound casual. As she spoke, his mind flashed back to the wedding night, her voice cold, her words sharp. You stay in the back. The memory burned, but he kept his face calm. Come in, he said softly. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once counted pennies for her school trips, once folded overtime paychecks into envelopes marked college. Now, years later, she sat across from him, asking again. But this time, things were different. He rose slowly, walked to his study, and returned with a folder thick with papers. He placed it gently on the table and opened it. Inside were documents she had never seen. Deeds to land, bank statements, certificates of investments, accounts that had quietly grown through decades of discipline. Her eyes widened. Her husband leaned forward, disbelief flickering across his face. Dad, I didn't know you had all this. He looked at her, his gaze steady. No, you want to know. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. You laughed at me, he continued quietly. You put me in the back, while another man took my place. You thought my worth was measured in clothes, in appearances, but what I carried was never on my jacket. It was here. He tapped the folder. And here. He placed a hand over his heart. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her face pale. Her husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You erased me in front of everyone, he said. But the truth can't be erased. The truth is that I built something with my hands, my sweat, my silence. And I did it for you. Whether you honor it or not, it exists. For the first time, she had no words. The man she had hidden in the back had just revealed himself as the foundation she had always stood on. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply laid the truth on the table, steady as stone. And in that moment, the power shifted. He closed the folder, sliding it back toward himself. This isn't for you to spend, he said firmly. This isn't to rescue you from choices you made. This is my legacy, and I will decide where it goes. Her eyes filled with tears. Whether from shame, regret, or anger, he couldn't tell. "Dad, I'm sorry," she whispered at last. But the words sounded thin, fragile, not yet heavy enough to carry the weight of what had been broken. He nodded slightly. "I hear you, but apologies are seeds. Let's see if they grow." As they left that day, he sat back in his chair, Eleanor's photo catching the afternoon light. For the first time since the wedding, he felt peace settle over him. Because the secret wasn't just money. It wasn't just property or accounts. The secret was that dignity cannot be assigned by others. It cannot be erased by humiliation. It lives in the quiet strength of a man who refuses to be defined by anyone else's blindness. When the door closed behind his daughter and her husband that afternoon, the house returned to silence. But it wasn't the same silence that had suffocated him after the wedding. This silence felt different, lighter somehow, steadier. For months, he had carried humiliation like a chain around his neck. Now he realized the chain had fallen. He sat at the kitchen table, Eleanor's photo glowing faintly on the shelf across the room. He whispered, "We did it, Eleanor. We built something they can't erase." For the first time in a long time, he felt proud, not of what others saw, but of what he knew to be true. That night, as he lay in bed, memories flickered like old film reels. His daughter as a child, running barefoot in the yard, calling him Daddy with joy in her voice. Her first day of school, clutching his hand so tightly he thought she might never let go. Her teenage years, when embarrassment began to creep into her eyes at his old truck and worn clothes. And finally, the wedding night, when the distance became complete. He felt the sting again, but this time it didn't burn as before. It felt more like a scar. Tender, yes, but healed enough to remind him he had survived. The reflection grew deeper in the days that followed. He realized that humiliation does not define a man. Response does. He had been erased publicly, but he had chosen to reclaim himself privately. And in that quiet reclamation, he found something more powerful than any apology could give: self-respect. Respect from others is fragile. It can be withheld, withdrawn, twisted by jealousy or arrogance. But respect for yourself, that is the bedrock. And once you learn to stand on it, no one can knock you down. He began to rebuild his life around that truth. In the mornings, he brewed his coffee and sat at the table with his journal. He wrote lines not for her, not for the world, but for himself. "I am not the man in the back row. I am the man who carried her this far. I am the man who built silently. I am the man who still stands." The words steadied him. Neighbors still asked about his daughter sometimes. They spoke of how beautiful the wedding had been, how radiant she looked. He nodded politely, but inside, his thoughts no longer twisted into shame. He had learned the secret Eleanor always hinted at. Dignity doesn't come from where you sit at someone else's table. It comes from how you carry yourself when you're asked to stand outside the door. He also thought of the apology she whispered at the table, fragile as paper. "I'm sorry." He didn't dismiss it, but he didn't cling to it either. Apologies are seeds, and seeds take time to grow. Maybe one day her apology would grow into action, into respect, into love reborn. Maybe not. Either way, he would not starve waiting for it. He had his own garden to tend now. Sometimes, when he passed a mirror, he paused to look. For years, he had seen only a man worn thin, a man others dismissed. Now he looked longer. He saw the lines on his face not as shame, but as proof of endurance. He saw the old jacket, not as a mark of poverty, but as a badge of sacrifice. He saw himself, not perfect, not polished, but whole. On Sundays, sitting on the porch as the sun set, he often thought of Eleanor. He imagined her voice teasing, "You never did buy a new suit, Henry." And he smiled, answering, "I didn't need one. This one carried me just fine." Because now he knew. Clothes fade, seats change, but dignity is stitched inside, where no hand can tear it. And so his reflection became his message to himself and to anyone who might listen. If your family pushes you aside, do not push yourself aside with them. If they erase you from their table, build your own. If they mock your simplicity, remember that worth is not written in labels, but in love, in sacrifice, in the quiet strength of showing up again and again. He closed his journal one evening, feeling a calm he hadn't known in months. Outside, the world carried on. Cars passed, children played, laughter drifted from open windows. Life was imperfect, but it was still life, and he still had his place in it. Not in the back row, not erased, but exactly where he chose to stand.